of the Special Senate Commission to study non-plurality voting methods and runoff elections for General Assembly and General Officer primaries. I'd like council please to take the roll.
Senator Zurier.
Here.
Senator Raptakis.
Here.
Senator DeLuca.
Here.
Nick Lima.
Here.
Kathleen Placencia.
Here.
Miguel Nunez.
Here.
Laurie Anderson. 6 present, 1 absent.
Before our discussion begins, I'd just like to provide a little overview of the purpose of today's meeting, particularly for the benefit of those of you who are watching and don't have a copy of the report before you. The purpose of today's meeting is to discuss a first draft of this commission's report. I'd like to give a big tip of the hat and thank you to legal counsel, Steve Hayes, and particularly Pat Breslin for their tremendous effort in putting this draft report together. The quantity of the report is obvious, but let me tell you, the quality exceeds the quantity. This was a complex issue. We're talking about the right to vote, and I'm very grateful for their analysis to get us where we are today. The way this draft report is set up, it first describes our current voting system and areas for possible improvement. Then it describes 4 alternative non-plurality voting systems, analyzing them from the standpoint of 3 areas, namely policy, implementation, and legal issues. And then this current draft has very brief suggested findings and recommendations. We're really looking for the commission at today's meeting to help fill out that portion of this report, as well as to improve and edit and correct the other sections that I've just described. Once we have the feedback from the commissioners, we will try to incorporate them into a second draft of the report, which may become close to the final draft of the report. The commission then will meet again on that and make any suggestions that are needed, ultimately leading to a vote to approve the report. Now I'd like to offer a brief summary of what's in the report, again, for those of you who are watching and don't have a copy. Good point. First I'll ask the commission members, do you all have a copy of the report? Okay. And by the way, there are other copies to hand out at today's meeting for those who are here. And finally, if you are not here and would like to get a copy of the report, please send an email to Pat Breslin at pbreslin@rilegislature.gov, and she'll be happy to send you a copy of this draft report. Now, the report, we're trying to address 2 issues, primarily 2 issues with our current pure plurality system. The first is what we call the multi-candidate issue. In a 2-candidate election, it's pretty clear. One candidate has a majority, the other doesn't, and it's pretty clear which candidate should be elected. However, if you have multi-candidate elections, i.e. 3 or more, then there can always be a question if a candidate wins by less than a majority, whether they represent a consensus of the will of the voters. So that's the multi-candidate issue. The second issue is the participation issue. Rhode Island has something called a semi-open primary process, whereby the major parties hold primaries, usually in September in a normal cycle. And voters can choose to affiliate with either party for the purpose of that primary, but they can only vote in one party's primary. They're free to disaffiliate afterwards for the next one. But participation in these primaries can be quite low. And when you have, in some districts, a preponderance of one party over the other, it's often the case that the winning candidate is in effect selected in the primary. So there's a question as to whether that is the best way to get candidates who best reflect the majority of the voters. And these 2 problems can pile on top of each other if you have a primary which has a multi-candidate issue and low participation. The report presents 4 alternatives. One is called ranked choice voting. In that, the voters get to in effect, rank the candidates in terms of their preference. And that can address the multi-candidate issue because it may mean that even though a candidate wins a plurality, that in fact the majority of voters prefer someone else. Some of the mechanics, I won't go into all the details, are that if you have several candidates on the ballot, the one with the lowest total gets knocked out if there's no majority winner. Those votes are redistributed based on the second choice votes and so on and so forth. In terms of implementation, this can create a more complex ballot because each choice is a grid rather than a single line. It also creates more challenges in terms of tabulating the votes and possibly also for something called a risk limiting audit that we currently have. There's a legal issue too. We have a provision in our Constitution that says for state elections, you have to choose the plurality winner. But there seems to be room in that for federal elections on the one hand and primary elections on the other. The next system we looked at was called top two voting. That's you see that mainly in California. What happens there is you have, and we actually see a version of that in some municipalities, including Cranston, where Mr. Lima serves. In that one, you have a single primary for all candidates. It's called nonpartisan. You can identify as a Democrat or Republican or Green or whatever, but everybody is in a single primary. And then the top two candidates from the primary are allowed to become part of the November ballot. And you have a November vote even if in the primary someone gets more than 50%, because you want to have the voters, all the voters, choose between those top two candidates. In terms of implementation, there's not the same kind of issues of a complex ballot, but there certainly needs to be a certain amount of voter education to get the voters to understand that these primaries are different from other primaries. And you could have a situation where, for example, two candidates from the same party are on the November ballot instead of being guaranteed that there'll be a Democrat and a Republican. In terms of legal issues, there seems to be a significant question as to whether this is permitted under our current Constitution. And it may be necessary to amend the Constitution to allow it, again, for statewide races. However, there would be no constitutional prohibition for federal races. The third system we looked at is called runoff elections. You see these primarily in the southern states, where if there's no candidate that wins a majority, you have a second election between the top two candidates for that position. And you can have a runoff either in a party primary in September in our case, or you could have a runoff in the November election. And this raises certain issues. Sometimes voters get tired of voting in all these elections. It raises additional expense. There may be deadline issues in terms of the amount of time you have to have between a primary and a general election if you have a runoff and a primary. So that's, and there are also possible legal issues, again, in terms of state elections, state general elections. The final form we consider is something called approval voting. And in approval voting, the voters get to vote, cast a vote for as many candidates as they prefer in a given stage. So if there are 12 candidates on the ballot, which is what happened in our congressional race, most recently in the 1st Congressional District, a voter could say, I'm casting a vote for 6 of these people that I support, but I don't like the other 6. And then all those votes are tabulated. And that represents another possible solution to the multi-candidate issue, because if you have 12 candidates on the ballot and you can only vote for one, it might be that that creates an incentive for a fringe candidate to be elected or nominated who doesn't have the support of the rest of the voters. And so by having multiple votes, rather having a voter choose multiple candidates, you can address the multi-candidate issue. This would also require implementation. Voters would have to understand that you can vote for more than one candidate and it's not going to hurt your preference. There are also questions in terms of how you would run a risk limiting audit for approval voting. And finally, there may be legal issues in terms of whether this is consistent with the principle of one person, one vote. So that is a very rapid overview of some of these systems. But I would now like to turn the floor over to each of the commission members. I would propose that we work our way around the table, starting with Senator Raptakis, to share with all of us what you observed and what you think of this report.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Basically, Coventry probably has the same process that Cranston does. We do have for our local elections a system probably closer to the number 2 issue. I guess it's the top 2. So what we do is we have nonpartisan elections, number 1, and the 2 top vote getters go on and run in November. Now, on a general election or a General Assembly election, I think it'd be wise probably to keep the labels so people would know that there's 3 Democrats running, a Republican running, and probably maybe a non-affiliated independent candidate running. And it's simplified. It's worked before. We've had it now for, I believe it's on our 4th election cycle for the last maybe 8 years, could be even longer. And it's worked out well. And the good thing about it, it normally allows more people to vote because a lot of voters are still afraid to go vote in a primary because they're afraid of being labeled. We still did not enact in the General Assembly a statute which allows someone that is unaffiliated voter to go vote in a primary, whether the Republican primary or the Democratic primary, and feel comfortable that they're leaving the polling place and not be to remain unaffiliated the way they went in. So I think that's one of the other reasons that we have a low voter turnout during our primaries. And I think that choosing the top 2 where you have any amount of candidates running in September, and then the top 2 vote getters are again in the November ballot, which I think I like it a lot. I'm very comfortable on it. And I'll tell you, one of the states which I believe went one further, which I think is going to be confusing, and you brought up a good point about voting maybe more than twice during an election cycle. I believe it was Alabama. They would, if I believe it wasn't the top 50%, they would go into a runoff, and that would be later on in December. And I think that adds a lot of confusion. I believe it was the state of Alabama. But I think that I like the top 2 voting system where we have an open primary, but we still keep the labels. Top 2 candidates continue on till November. I like the ranked choice, but only during every 4 years during the presidential preference primary. I believe it gives the voters a little bit more choice. There are so many presidential candidates that are running, and it's done once every 4 years. So that would be separate from a September and November election cycle. And that's my clear thoughts, and I like something that's already been used, and especially in my town. I know Nick Lima is the Board of Elections Director in Cranston, but he's also a Coventry resident, so we've seen it work well in our community for the last at least 4 election cycles. So I think it'd be, number 1, it generate more voter enthusiasm, less confusion like the ranked choice that's done in Alaska. And I think it would be probably more enthusiastic for the voter to say, listen, I'm going to go vote. Now I can pick. I don't have to worry about the primary, about going into either the Republican primary or the Democratic primary, and choosing somebody that I feel I like that candidate as my first preference. And then at least those top 2 candidates have a choice to opportunity to run again in November. Those are my thoughts, Mr. Chairman.
Good. Thank you, Senator. Ms. Plasencia.
Thank you, Chairman. So again, with the equipment that we currently have, it would take, there would be a cost associated with implementing any changes to our voting equipment. And again, I think the most important piece is that the voter, candidate, and poll worker training, they have to be educated, and that is the most important piece when changing any voting methods in Rhode Island.
Thank you. Mr. Nunez.
Thank you, Chairman. When I was looking at going over the report and reviewing the four different options presented based on discussions over the course of our meetings here, I sort of ranked them in my mind with what's the easiest to administer and what's it's the least easy to administer. Because of course we would administer any change in the electoral process that the General Assembly approves. However, some of them are easier than others to actually administer. And for me, the easiest to administer would be the top two because it's something that Rhode Islanders are already familiar with, as was mentioned in Coventry and Cranston, as well as a few other jurisdictions. The voters are already familiar with that process. So there would not be a tremendous amount of public education needed in order to implement that sort of change. Also, it does allow for enough time in the same setup that we have between the primary and the general election. However, the primary does need to be moved up for other reasons. However, the process of a top two would essentially remain the similar format that we have today. Would not require any additional voting equipment to be purchased or any additional personnel because essentially we'd be running the same primary setup in September and in November. The early voting would be able to stay the same at the current 20 days as it is today. So I don't see a tremendous amount of change in comparison to, for example, ranked choice voting or the approval voting system. My main concern with the ranked choice voting and the approval voting is that there are several legal challenges going on with it, most recently in Maine, but also in the state of Alaska. And we as election officials, we want timeline certainty. Calendars and elections are very important, and we are essentially major event planners for these calendars many, many months and even years in advance. So if you have an uncertainty in the legal system, whether or not a particular voting method of voting is going to be legally challenged, then that could upset the calendar and the timeline and planning for that election. And with those legal challenges, for example, in the state of Maine and in the state of Alaska, certainly I think it would be prudent to see how those play out in those different jurisdictions and around the country before Rhode Island does so. You know, in Rhode Island, we're not afraid of being trailblazers in elections. We certainly had a paper ballot back in 1997 when many other jurisdictions had DREs. And we certainly were not afraid to conduct the first risk limiting audit, the first state to do so statewide back in the year 2000. So we certainly are not afraid of being trailblazers in the electoral process, but we certainly would like to see some of the legal challenges played out for ranked choice voting because there would be a significant amount of education required for ranked choice voting in order, because it is such a distinct and different type of voting than we're currently accustomed to. And as I mentioned during our meetings, one of the concerns with ranked choice voting, for example, would be the longer ballot, because the current ballot layout is a 3-column grid, as was discussed in the report, whereas ranked choice voting goes across the ballot, which would lead to a longer ballot, meaning this would be a 2-page or 3-page ballot. And a ballot could be front side and back side. So in my experience at the polling place, seeing the process in polling places, some of our issues come up in our multi-page ballot communities. So for example, if you have a 2-page and a 3-page ballot, that means that voting scanner has to read 3 times as many ballots. That means you have to put potentially 3 times as many pieces of voting equipment in that location. So any change to the ballot in the length of the ballot certainly affects the process and the efficiency of the polling place. And the final point on ranked choice voting is that there has not been a proven method yet of conducting an RLA on it, although it is something that has been piloted by certain jurisdictions. While we're required to conduct an RLA prior to certification, I think that it's not something that has been done on the scale of a statewide level. So conducting an RLA on a ranked choice voting would certainly need some time to develop. And in terms of the other methods, the runoff and the approval voting, Certainly, the runoff method is something that is probably the second most likely under all of these four scenarios, because it is something, as is mentioned, that already exists in parts of the United States, although it does not have it does sort of have a negative connotation associated with, as it was used in the South, as we learned in our previous meetings, but it is widely used in South America, in the Caribbean, and in Europe. So it definitely has a historical precedent, but however, it would lead to higher costs, because obviously you need to schedule 2 elections in advance, possibly 4 elections if you're going to conduct a runoff for the primary, and that would lead to some changes for increased costs for our local jurisdictions if they have to hire as many poll workers, twice as many poll workers, et cetera. And then the final mention that I saw in the report was that the runoff elections typically have a lower turnout than the actual initial election, which some jurisdictions have countered that by perhaps opening fewer polling places in the runoff election. However, in my experience, that does sometimes lead to some confusion with voters, because if they go and vote at a polling place and then 3 weeks later their polling place changes. Now, first they were going to the community center, and now they're going to the public library 3 weeks later. That can certainly lead to some confusion, and that probably would mean a lot of jurisdictions would leave the polling places the same in order to avoid any kind of voter confusion. So those are some of the factors that we as election administrators would look at, whereas some places you can save costs, but other places it is the cost of conducting the election in order to maintain clarity with voters in terms of where they vote and when the election is actually held. So in summary, my ranking would be that the top 2 is probably the easiest to administer from an administrative process, with ranked choice voting probably be the most difficult, just because of how different it is, the amount of education that it would take, and certainly some of the legal challenges that are going on with it right now.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Mr. Lima, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So, thinking about the legal challenges that go along with implementing non-plurality voting, the draft report goes into, I think, very good detail about which challenges have been kind of looked at or adjudicated in Rhode Island case law, but what's going on elsewhere around the country. One of the biggest fears I have as an elections administrator is the public losing trust or confidence in elections. And the easiest way that can happen is if some part of the elections apparatus fails or doesn't work as people expect it. It's very hard to gain the trust of voters. It's extremely hard, as we know, to keep the trust of voters, but then once lost, it's extremely hard to gain it back. So I think one key recommendation, I think, for the report should note is to ensure that in whatever the General Assembly ultimately decides to do, that there be a very solid timeline put in place in any future legislation to implement changes to that process, to ensure that election officials have time to make sure that our equipment can work properly, we can modify ballot design, testing procedures, to modify or create any new rules or regulations that may be necessary. But I think the most important thing of all is voter education. When you've got people voting a certain way their entire lives, they're accustomed to a particular method of voting. Having a 2, 3, ideally a 4-year lead time to implement changes to that process and allow the Secretary of State's office and the Board of Elections and the local canvassing authorities to work with good government groups to communicate that change, I think is essential. It ensures that we do no harm. The whole idea of non-plurality voting is to look at ways to increase turnout, to look at ways to increase voter engagement, and to ensure that the winners actually reflect the will of the electorate. But we also have to make sure we avoid chaos, we avoid confusion in our elections process, and ensure that everything's on a solid legal footing. So that's one, I think, question I still have there is, while yes, the primaries can operate under different rules, particularly party primaries, if we were to take, for example, independent candidates and they were to go on the ballot in a runoff type election, are we then restricting the access of independent candidates from making it on the general election ballot in November? And by doing so, our independent candidates losing their ability to access the ballot in a way that's inconsistent with the Constitution if the Constitution isn't changed. So I think that's, especially when it comes to state or statewide offices, I think that's just an important consideration because the worst case scenario for election officials would be if the law were to change and those constitutional questions aren't fully settled or there isn't a solid opinion or consensus on what the effect would be, which would result, as I think Miguel pointed out, a legal challenge and then a disruption to our election calendar and disruption to the process or even a redo of an election, which is, I think, a worst case scenario. Senator Raptakis's bill, which had a co-sponsor in the House, S-115 on the Senate side, about automatic disaffiliation for voters in primary elections, I think is very helpful in answering that turnout question. It's not really, it's not ranked choice voting, it's not non-plurality voting, but I think it goes hand in hand with the same conversation and discussion. I know the draft report mentions that, and I think that's a good thing that it mentions it because it's a piece of the puzzle, I think, in solving the systemic problems that we have in trying to increase turnout, in trying to increase voter engagement, and increase the confidence in elections by getting more people to participate, not just in general elections, but in primaries as well. And one other thing that Miguel just mentioned, too, is the difficulty with RLAs, especially when it comes to ranked choice voting. A couple of the cited studies in the report from 2011, 2012, they were kind of more thought experiments. Colorado in 2017 is among the first states, along with Rhode Island, that have implemented risk limiting audits on a statewide basis, and that was several years after that. And I think there's still a lot of academic research, a lot of peer review to look into different methods that can be applied for RLAs to non-plurality voting and overcome some of the challenges. I mean, there's some postulated ways of how it can be done. I'm a part of the election verification network, and that's something that's being debated very hotly amongst verified voting and among a number of other groups. But I think it is very strong consideration, particularly considering Rhode Island's adoption of RLAs, and that's really fast becoming the gold standard around the country in terms of post-election auditing is the risk limiting audit. So any procedure that that the state adopts to run our elections, I think, needs to be compatible with RLAs. I think it's important for the report to note that as well. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this commission.
Thank you, Mr. Lima. Senator DeLuca.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. After listening to all the testimony of the experts, my biggest concern was that we can pass a law and suddenly our voting system would change. As I said before, it should be up to the voters to decide if we should, in fact, move to a ranked choice system. I do have concerns which many have been brought up by my fellow commissioners as well as the experts. It is more complex than I originally thought. We always talk about access to voting and making it easier. I feel like requiring voters to pick several people may be considered an additional burden. The election results can be significantly delayed, which I think is a problem for public trust in the integrity of the election process. The cost sounds like it would be prohibitive. Our municipalities have super tight budgets, and I am not sure where the money for the unfunded mandate would come from, except for possibly raising property taxes, which I hope none of us are for. I was very interested to hear whether this does or does not violate the Supreme Court of the United States, a longstanding precedent that we have one person, one vote. It may not violate that principle, but it certainly feels like people are voting more than once, even if it is not technically what is happening because of the ranking. I do think that runoffs are something we need to dig into. With runoff elections, it is absolutely ensures that the winner would receive at least 50% plus one. But those are my feelings. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I'll offer my thoughts at this time. I was looking at it through the lens of the two problems that the report identified, which I think a number of the presenters talked about too, which is how do we get, is it possible to get closer to majority rule on the one hand, and also how can we improve voter participation? I did not find approval voting to be, it offers an approach to the multi-candidate issue, but it doesn't guarantee a majority. You could have many more votes in a primary, but you could still have that you might have many candidates five candidates who are at 33%, but you don't have someone who's at a majority. And in addition, it does appear that would require a change to the Constitution. The runoffs, I agree with commission members who say this could induce voter fatigue if you have 4 elections instead of 2. So that leaves me with the other two, ranked choice and top 2. Speaking personally from a policy view, I think that either of those 2 systems would be an improvement over what we have. One thing that I've focused on as a voter since my time in Rhode Island are these 3-way elections. I happen to be a Providence resident, and I used to have a Mayor Cianci who thrived on these 3-way elections. He would always get 35% or a little better out of the total when the majority of people wanted somebody else. And these are not the only 3-way elections we've had. We've had them in the election for governor. We've had them for primaries, as detailed in the report. And I think that 3-way elections present the strongest case for ranked choice voting. Because if you have 3 candidates and none of them hit a majority, you take the third choice, the second choice of the third place candidate, and then you have a majority. It's less stress on the voter because they're only choosing among 3. The more candidates that are on the ballot, the more difficult ranked choice becomes. How many are you going to rank? The ballot becomes longer, as Mr. Nunez correctly noted. We heard in our testimony that 5 is the right number, but I still think that's a lot for voters to handle. But with that said, I still think it would be an improvement over what we have. The advantages I see to top 2 are the ease of implementation, and also it means that the November ballot has just 2 candidates on it. So we know we're going to get a majority. But with that said, it may be messy in the primary. You could have 12 people on that primary ballot. And again, we had that in our congressional race. And the top 2, it's better than the top 1, but you still might end up with 2 relatively fringe candidates. And you haven't had the same kind of guarantee that you'll have majority support. With that said, I believe it's an improvement. Personally, I believe it's an improvement and closer to majority rule than we currently have. However, I also think that the legal analysis that our staff ably provided seems to indicate there may be a problem implementing that for statewide elections under our Constitution. And that is why I expect to introduce in the next General Assembly session a proposal to amend our Constitution to get rid of that section which says plurality only. It has its own interesting history, which we described in the report. So to sum up, I personally believe that ranked choice or top 2 would be an improvement over what we have in terms of these multi-candidate elections. If we're lucky, and it sounds as if they have some success at this in Coventry, more people will come to the primary, which also would be a benefit. It may be, though, that given the fact what our Constitution says, that we'd have to start with federal offices before attempting it on a statewide basis. I think the cleanest way to do that would be through a constitutional amendment, but there'd also be a possibility of seeking a legal opinion from the Supreme Court if we want to try to do that as well. So those are my thoughts. I'll offer everyone around the table, if you want, a chance to react to what the people after you said. Anything more?
Mr. Chair, now I agree. We had brought up that issue regarding asking, and we have in the past, the General Assembly has asked our Supreme Court for a legal advisory opinion on an issue. And I think if the time constraints, they've done a good job coming back to the General Assembly in probably certain months, not a year or 9 or 12 months. So we can maybe ask to address that issue through this body, the Senate and the House, would request a legal opinion from the Supreme Court to answer that question, whether we need to change the Constitution without introducing legislation. If we can get that done before the next session adjourns, that would be probably in the right step to address that important question. I know in our towns of Coventry, Cranston, and I believe the Deputy Director of Elections, Mr. Nunez, had said that there's other municipalities, I don't think they've had a court challenge or it was unconstitutional the way they have it set up now. The big question might be whether we keep the labels of the candidate. I know they're nonpartisan, but if we had the same setup as Coventry and Cranston, but identify the candidate, would that be an issue, whether it would be unconstitutional? So I think a legal opinion from the Supreme Court asking them, could you have a nonpartisan election, meaning more than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 candidates, sort of an open primary, and then make sure that it is legal by identifying those as Democrats or Republicans or independent, whatever the case might be. So that might be one issue that I think that we should probably try to address. It would simplify our process when we do introduce legislation to draft the legislation the right way. We don't want to pass something in the General Assembly and then find out it's unconstitutional. So I'm saying go to the Supreme Court first, get our legal advisory opinion from the Supreme Court, which will help us draft the legislation. And one more point, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I think I brought it out earlier, but again, some of these elections, we have voter fatigue. I know brought up the point in Europe, in Athens, Greece, again, I want to reiterate that they had an election a week later, only 35% of the people came out participating, when the week before, I think it was about 70% of the electorate came out and voted. And the sitting mayor, had 41% of the vote. Didn't make the 50% cut. His second and third candidates' opponents only had 17%. And what happened was, because of voter fatigue, only 35% came out and voted, and the mayor lost. So to be fair to all the candidates, that I think that voter fatigue is something that we have to be aware of when we make a decision. Thank you.
Ms. Plasencia, anything you'd like to add?
I don't, no.
Okay. Mr. Nunez?
I think I just wanted to reiterate, as far as implementation, the choices that I presented, which would be the most difficult, being ranked choice, and the easiest would be the top 2, also lines up with your suggestions that these probably the 2 that would probably solve the problem of not having a majority being reached in the election. And I think that in terms of voter confidence, and which was brought up by Mr. Lima, it brings me back to November of 2020, when we had 175,000 mail ballots to process during the height of the pandemic, which was 5 times as many as we had ever processed in the past at the Board of Elections. And one of the things that we did take some criticism for was because of the release of the mail ballot results on the election night. I mean, how long that took, given the fact that we did have 5 times as many ballots as we had ever done. And I think even that small delay, even though we did release at 2 a.m. in the morning after we finally counted as much as we could until we could leave it to the next day, even that small delay generated just a dip in public confidence. Is why was it taking the Board of Elections this long to count all of these mail ballots? And in the report, as mentioned, some of these ranked choice voting results take 7 to 8 days to come out. I'm not sure why it takes that long, but it says some of the rounds take up to 7 to 8 days to release them. And again, that's something to consider as far as the delay in releasing the results, because I think each day that passes that there are no results, obviously that does lead to some impact on voter confidence out there. And I just want to reiterate that all of these changes, it appears, would require some sort of legislative action or constitutional change before they could happen. So with that being said, I think that some of the changes presented in the report, such as the disaffiliation statute, which my board did vote to support that legislation, to not have a voter automatically disaffiliate, to have a voter, not become affiliated with a party in the party primary. I think that's something that moves that in the right direction to some point to increase the turnout in the primary. However, some of these changes that would be required here should probably be settled well before Election Day, as I said, so that any kind of legal challenges or any uncertainty in the election calendar is resolved well before the elections are scheduled to, and the election cycle is scheduled to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Nunez. Mr. Lima.
I would just say that I do like the chairman's idea to introduce legislation in the upcoming session for the ballot to basically going in and around trying to figure out the legal question and actually settle it in the Constitution. You make it abundantly clear, take out any sense of doubt or uncertainty, which again is uncertainty is the enemy of an elections administrator. So if that can get on the ballot and the voters approve it, I think that goes a long way towards advancing these processes and these changes, because it makes it much easier. It takes a lot of that that question about could there be a legal challenge? Could there be an upset to our election calendar or our process based off of anyone filing a lawsuit about an election process? That constitutional solution, I think, really makes it a lot easier, or greases the wheels of the path, so to say.
Thank you. Senator DeLuca.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. I believe it would be good to get an opinion from the courts on the constitutionality of it all. And I think that would be the first step. Thanks.
Yeah. I'd like to thank all of you for the thought and time you've put into working on this. I can't finish without offering my dream magic wand solution to this from a policy point of view. And that is a hybrid system that they have currently in Alaska. It's called Final Four. What they do in Alaska is, and this is in the report, it's not highlighted, but it caught my fancy. What they do in Alaska is, instead of having top two, they have top four. And the result of that is that you have less of a risk at that first stage of getting two fringe candidates. And I think that's particularly important if you have an election that's evenly balanced between the two major parties, because then you could have a fringe Republican and a fringe Democrat, each of whom is able to command a plurality among their caucus. And then what Alaska does is it says in the general election, we'll just take those top four and we'll do ranked choice. Now, it has a number of practical problems which have been very well laid out by commission members this afternoon. Again, if I had a magic wand, I'd do one better on Alaska. I'd have it be the final three. Because as I said before, these three-way elections are what drive me crazy. And I think that a three-way election, it's easiest for the voter to understand, how to rank the three voters. And it's the best way to avoid these three-way elections. We have maybe 4 or 5 of them documented in the report. With that said, a critic might view that ideal solution is very difficult to implement, maybe even a Rube Goldberg solution. So I don't know if it's if it would be the top way to improve the two issues that we identified as in need of improvement. But with that said, I do think that it offers, just from a pure policy as opposed to an implementation or a legal point of view, one optimal solution to the problems we identified. So with that, unless there are any more comments from the commission, I don't see everyone's shaking their head. Our next step will be to prepare a proposed report. And it's quite possible, given the range of views that we've heard this afternoon, that some of the findings or recommendations, it's not going to be everybody finds this or everybody finds that. It may be that we'll say some of the people who identify them like it this way and others like it that way. That's up to our crack drafts person to work on. But we do hope that we'll be able to put it in a form where everybody is comfortable signing off on it, and we'll have a chance to do that. I'm guessing it's going to take something like a month for that. With that in mind, if there are no other comments from the commission, I guess I would accept a motion to adjourn.
Make that motion.
Okay, seconded. Everyone in favor? Aye. Okay, thanks, everybody. We'll stay in touch.